Right, committee. Welcome to Legislative Post-Audit Committee, and we apologize for the delay. We will go ahead and get started. Reminder to everyone that the meeting is being live streamed. Remind members that to turn on and use their mics during the meeting. And a special thank you to Eric Stafford from the Kansas Chamber for providing lunch. Committee members, if you did not pick up your lunch, please pick that up on your way out today. So thank you, Eric. He's in the back of the room there. I would like to now recognize Matt from Legislative Post Audit to present the audit for the Unemployment Insurance Fraud Part 1. Welcome, Matt.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Members of the committee, my name is Matt Edsel. I'm going to be presenting the findings from the first part of our two-part audit looking at the Kansas Department of Labor's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Part one of this audit included a single objective, and that was to determine what unemployment fraud schemes occurred both nationally and in Kansas in 2020, and to determine what the Kansas Department of Labor did to address that fraud. So today I'm going to cover three broad topics. First, I'll go over our findings on unemployment fraud schemes and the Department of Labor's process to detect fraud. Second, I'll go over a high-level preliminary estimate on how much fraud could have occurred in Kansas in 2020. And then third and finally, I'll talk about the financial impact unemployment fraud could have on Kansas employees and employers. Before I dive into our findings, I want to give you a little bit of background on unemployment benefits, which begin on page 2 of the audit report. The Kansas Department of Labor oversees the state's regular unemployment insurance program. Regular unemployment insurance gives financial assistance to individuals that lost their job for certain qualifying reasons. Traditionally, regular unemployment benefits are funded entirely by employers. There's two main ways that employers pay for these benefits. The first is as a contributing employer who pay the Department of Labor a quarterly unemployment tax. That tax revenue is deposited into the state's unemployment trust fund and used to pay out on regular unemployment claims. The second way is as a reimbursing employer. In this case, instead of paying a quarterly tax up front, reimbursing employers repay the Department of Labor for any regular unemployment funds that they used. Now, in early 2020, the federal government created 3 temporary federal unemployment programs to help people who lost their jobs specifically because of COVID-19. All 3 of these federal programs are funded entirely with federal CARES Act funds, so they do not impact the state's regular unemployment trust fund. The main federal program I'm going to talk about today is the Pandemic Unemployment Assistance Program, or PUA for short. The PUA program offers unemployment benefits to people that are not covered under the state's regular unemployment insurance program. So, for example, people that are self-employed would not be covered under the state's regular unemployment program, but would be covered under the federal Pandemic Unemployment Assistance Program, or PUA program. With that background in mind, I'm going to move on to our findings, which begin on page 5 of the report. So, overall, we found that the Kansas Department of Labor's fraud detection process wasn't designed to detect the kind of large-scale national fraud campaigns that occurred during the pandemic in 2020. So let me unpack that a little bit and explain first what fraud schemes occurred last year. One of the main fraud schemes that occurred in 2020 specifically targeted the federal PUA program. Stakeholders we talked to told us fraudsters were targeting states' unemployment programs specifically to get access to those PUA benefits. And that occurred nationally as well as in Kansas in 2020. And there's a few reasons why the PUA program was so attractive to fraudsters. For one, there are some weaknesses in how the federal government designed the application process for PUA benefits. So for example, under federal requirements, you didn't need to submit supporting documentation to apply for PUA. So fraudsters didn't have to submit proof of income to receive these benefits. Also, as I mentioned before, individuals that were self-employed were eligible for PUA benefits. Traditionally, one of the controls that state departments have to weed out fraudulent claims was to verify those claims with an employer. This check wasn't always available under the PUA program because you can't verify with an employer for people that are self-employed. So for those reasons, state departments were a little limited in how they could verify PUA claims. In addition to that, the pool program was also attractive to fraudsters because of how much they could potentially steal from it. Under the program, you could receive up to about $500 per week for 39 weeks, up to 39 weeks. Fraudsters figured out that they could also maximize their payments by applying for back pay and get as much of those weekly benefits as possible at once. On top of that, you have other federal programs, unemployment programs, that could add as much as $600 a week on top of those existing benefits. So you combine the fact that it was relatively easy for fraudsters to get approved for PUA with the potential for large payouts, and all of a sudden you have a lot of incentive for a large-scale national fraud scheme, which is exactly what we saw. And fraudsters are smart. They didn't just file one PUA claim. They gathered enough stolen personal information to apply for PUA benefits in mass quantities. So one fraudster could file for and receive PUA benefits under multiple people's names, maximizing how much in PUA benefits they could steal. We also heard more recently, towards the end of 2020 and into January 2021, that Kansas's regular unemployment program was also being targeted by fraudsters. If you look at figure 1 on page 4 of the report, the blue line there represents regular unemployment claims filed in Kansas. As you can see, the number of regular unemployment claims increased dramatically from about 23,000 claims in September 2020 to about 134,000 by January 2021. Now, some of that increase could very well be legitimate claims, but we also know from the Department of Labor that the state's unemployment program was hit fairly hard with fraud during that time. And fraud within the state's regular unemployment program would also negatively impact the state's unemployment trust fund. Figure 3 on page 9 of the report shows that the balance of the state's trust fund through 2020, which, as you can see, declined by about 75% over the course of the year. And there is a little bit more of a significant drop there the closer you get to the end of 2020. Again, it's likely that decline is due to a combination of fraudulent and legitimate claims. And we are doing work in part 2 of our audit to understand what impact fraud had specifically on the state's unemployment trust fund. We also worked with the Department of Labor to understand their process to detect fraud. As I mentioned before, a big part of the department's process to identify unemployment fraud is validating claims with a former employer. And again, under the PUA program specifically, department officials weren't always able to do that, which did limit them in some ways. In reviewing the rest of the department's process, we learned most of their fraud detection process was manual and not well suited to handle the high number of claims seen in both the state's regular unemployment program and the PUA program. So, for example, officials told us they could review claims data to identify suspicious data points, they could cross-check claims against new hire reports, or they compare Kansas claims to a national database of known suspicious data. Those are all good tests, but they're all mostly very manual tests, which can be time-consuming and not as effective as a more automated process, which could review higher volumes of claims for fraud. Department officials told us they are taking steps to automate and improve their fraud detection process. Those steps are listed on page 7 of the report. I'm not going to go through each of these in detail, but wanted to highlight one step the department took very recently, and that was to implement an identity verification system. The system should ask people applying for benefits questions only they should know based off of their credit history. I think this process could help verify applicants' identity and potentially reduce the number of fraudulent claims that get through in Kansas. With that, I'll move on to our fraud estimate, which begins on page 10 of the report. I'd like to start by saying that it's a high-level preliminary fraud estimate. We are currently using Department of Labor's unemployment claims data to come up with a more detailed and precise estimate, which we'll have ready for part 2 of this audit. Until then, we wanted to provide some sense, though, even if it's just a rough estimate on how much an unemployment fraud could have occurred in Kansas in 2020. Ultimately, we estimated that about $600 million in unemployment benefits paid in Kansas in 2020 could have been fraudulent. So let me walk you through that methodology a little bit and how we got to that number. When we were doing our work, we didn't yet have the department's detailed claims data. What we did have, though, was that the department reported it identified about 157,000 claims as potentially fraudulent in Kansas in 2020. We also knew that there is roughly 650,000 initial claims filed in the state that year. So we use those two numbers to estimate that about 24% of claims filed in Kansas last year could have been fraud. We applied that 24% fraud rate to the $2.6 billion in total unemployment benefits paid in Kansas last year. In doing that, we estimated that about $600 million of total benefits paid out last year could potentially have been fraudulent. We were able to break our estimate down into a little bit more detail, estimating that about $200 million of that potential fraud was tied to state funds and $400 million was tied to federal funds. There are some important assumptions and limitations with this estimate, which are listed on page 11. Again, I won't go into detail on all of these, but I do want to mention one key assumption, and that is that our estimate is very contingent on those 157,000 claims the department identified as potentially fraudulent. And there's two things to keep in mind about that number. First, not all of those 157,000 claims will end up being fraud. They have to go through an investigative process, and it's not likely that 100% of them will actually be fraud. And that could potentially overstate our estimate. And on the other hand, it's likely there are a lot more than 157,000 fraudulent claims that occurred in Kansas that the Department of Labor was not able to identify, which would potentially understate our estimate. But again, we're working through the department's claims data right now, and we'll have more information on how much unemployment fraud occurred in Kansas in part 2 of our report. With that, I'll move on to our last finding, which involves the financial impact unemployment fraud could have on employees and employers, and starts on the bottom of page 11. We found that if fraud isn't either reported to or stopped by the Department of Labor, Kansas employees could end up owing taxes on fraudulent claims. So all unemployment benefits, both state and federal, are considered taxable income. Around this time of year, the Department of Labor mails 1099-G forms to claimants showing how much in benefits they received and will ultimately be taxed on. What happened earlier this year is that some individuals received a 1099-G in the mail for benefits that were filed fraudulently in their name. We talked to Department of Labor officials about this. They told us they tried to prevent 1099-Gs from going out on cases that they had identified as potentially fraudulent. But despite that, some people still receive these forms in error. Department officials told us anyone who receives a 1099-G form in error should contact them to get that amended. And as long as they can go through that process, they should not be held responsible for paying taxes on fraudulent claims. Similarly, if fraud isn't appealed or stopped by the Department of Labor, it's possible that employers could also be financially responsible for fraud. Here we're just talking about fraud within the state's regular unemployment program. And again, there's two ways that employers pay for the state's regular employment program, either as a contributing employer or a reimbursing employer. Because contributing employers' tax rates are based on their past employment charges, fraud could raise their future rates. Similarly, because reimbursing employers have to pay the department back for benefits they use, they could also be responsible for paying back fraudulent charges. That being said, the department told us there is an appeals process, which, if completed, the employer should be held harmless for those charges. That concludes my summary of our audit findings. I'm happy to stand for any questions that the committee has.
All right, thank you, Matt, and thank you by providing all the page numbers as you made references. That's actually very helpful. Committee, I'd like to take an opportunity for you to ask questions. Senator Thompson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for your overview. Can you tell us when the Department of Labor identified the problem with the fraud? Were they aware of it from a fairly early time, or did they just discover this recently?
I don't have an exact date for you. It wasn't recently. We've been working with them since October, and they were well aware of it when we began the audit in October of last year.
So sometime after October of last year?
I can't say if they knew before or after October. That's just when we started working with them on that. But I don't have an exact date for you on when they became aware of it.
Okay. If I may, Madam Chair?
You may, and also do remember that we'll have an opportunity to ask questions of the Deputy Secretary.
Okay, thank you. Do you know if there were any fraud identification programs in place prior to the pandemic that would be able to identify this stuff when it's happened? In other words, you know, they pick up on unemployment fraud prior to this type situation. Was there something in place prior to that, or was it very rudimentary?
The department had a process to detect unemployment fraud, but it was focused on the state's regular unemployment program, not the new federal programs that came out as part of the pandemic. The process that they had to identify fraud within the regular unemployment program was more manual, which is why when claims spiked during the pandemic, those processes got a little bit overwhelmed.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Other questions? Representative, Senator Tyson.
That's fine. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for your presentation. I was doing a little bit of research, and in 2007, there was a legislative post-audit that specifically spoke to fraud at that time. Are you saying then that there were no applications or electronic or efforts to ramp up fraud from fraudulent protection from 2007 until now?
I know there was some funding the Department of Labor received in the past, I think to update some of their IT systems. I'm not entirely sure what ended up happening with the funding to update those IT systems, but I do know that at the time of this audit, they were not automated systems. It was still a fairly process.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
And we know, Senator, that the Department of Labor received federal money of about $1.7 million in August, September to take care of some of their fraud issues. And if you look at the graph that's provided by Post Audit on page 4, you could see that had they used those dollars to stop the bleeding in September, we'd be in a good place. But it looks like a large majority of those fraudulent claims likely happened from September 2020 to January 2021. And I was going to ask a question. This does not, of course, include any improper payments. This is just straight out fraud, not the improper payments portion.
To our fraud estimate.
Yes.
Yeah. So I would say my answer to that would be it's a very high level estimate. So it's based off of 157,000 claims the Department of Labor identified as potentially fraudulent. So during their review of claims, they found enough fraud indicators on those to stop payment on those 157,000 claims. So yes, I guess I would say that it's based on fraud, not overpayment, but they're not known fraud cases, they're potentially fraudulent cases.
Okay, so would it be possible then to make the assumption that the improper claims, where Kansas ranks about 14.21% of improper claims, would be in addition to the estimates that you're providing?
I would say we didn't really focus on improper claims. I don't have as much of a background in that as I do on fraud at this time, but that may be a question.
And if it were in addition, just as a general comment, we would be talking about for just the state portion of an additional 157 million, the federal portion additional 166 million. And that's a total of 323 million for just improper claims if we were at the rate we were prior to the pandemic. It's just a kind of a side note. And then one question on the federal guidelines. The federal guidelines did not require some of those cross-checks or, verifications. Did they prohibit verifications, or is it just not require?
So the federal guidelines were really specific to the supporting documentation that did not need to be submitted to apply for PUA benefits. So if I was applying, I did not have to submit proof of prior income to get PUA benefits. There were no, I do not believe there were any prohibitions on cross-checking them on the back end of that. It was more on the front end of that in applying and trying to get those applications through quickly so as to prohibit having to submit supporting documentation of prior income.
Thank you. Any other questions from committee? Yes, Representative Tarwater, and I failed to mention that Representative Tarwater is substituting in today for Representative Topliker, so welcome.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Glad to be here. Matt, thanks for your information. So am I to understand that the 24% number that you came up with was simply the Department of Labor telling you what they thought they identified? Did you identify any claims? Did you get to review any claims?
We are in the process of that. We got our unemployment claims data from the Department of Labor for all of 2020 about 2 or 3 weeks ago, and we as we speak, we are going through that data and we are analyzing it and looking to get our own estimate on how much fraud occurred during 2020. Absent of that, we wanted to be able to provide some estimate for you here today. And so that is why we relied on the 157,000 claims that the department identified as fraud last year.
So, okay. We took their word for it then. The reason I asked is, were you able to review any quarterly statements from reimbursing employers for the fourth quarter of 2020?
We did not know.
Okay, we've reviewed several of them, and we've met with several schools that are reimbursing employers, and they're the only ones we can really get good information from at this point because it's right there in front of them. The quarterly, the reimbursing employers are the ones that have to pay the trust fund back because we paid claims on their behalf. They get statements every quarter, and as they go through their statements, they almost to the T have all identified at least 75% of the claims that are on those statements that we paid on their behalf out of the state fund were fraudulent. And most of them that were, they were reported to the department but still paid. And so that, in my mind, would be a much stronger number. Now, I understand that the claims in March were probably real claims, but if you look at your chart on page 4, we're actually, in March, the governor shut down the state. So there was a spike there. But when you get to December and January, we're paying out more. There were more initial claims than there were when we closed the whole state. And so the 24% figure, in my opinion, is ridiculously low. If the 75% figure for, let's just take September through the end of the year, applied, what would your estimate be then? Because that's the number we're seeing.
I'd hate to speak too early on that, and that is a number that we do hope to have. We hope to have a better estimate, our estimate, based off of our analysis on Department of Labor's data in part 2 of our audit, and that wouldn't include an analysis on fraud's effects specifically on the state's trust fund, which is being affected by fraud, the reimbursing entities that you had mentioned.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair. Could I ask one more? Chairwoman Williams mentioned that we had, that the federal government gave us $1.7 million in September for the identity cross-check that we waited until January to put in. Employers, the Commerce Interim Committee, we discussed fraud all year long. And the federal government warned us and then gave us funding. Was there any discussion on why they waited until we paid out most of our trust fund before they decided to put that in? It was, from what I understand, it was a simple fix and it was separate from our system. And so why did they wait until we were out of money? Was there discussion, why did they wait when we were warned about it in April, May, June, discussion in July, funded for it in September? We waited until the end of January when we were almost out of money to put the stop in. Was there a discussion on why they waited?
There was not, and unfortunately, a lot of our scope was really focused on the fraud that occurred in 2020. We did include, knowing that this fraud was happening in late 2020 and into January and February, we tried to pick that up and include it in the scope of our audit as we're wrapping up, but we haven't had time to do a really deep dive into the more recent fraud that's been happening within the state's regular unemployment system. That was kind of a late-breaking part of our audit for us in the last few weeks of our field work.
Thank you.
All right, and we will have an opportunity to now speak to Representative Brett Flashbarth. Not representative, I keep saying that, Deputy Secretary of Labor, Brett Flashbarth, and we would now give you the opportunity to address the committee. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair and members of the committee. In addition to myself, I also have on the line with us today Acting Secretary Amber Schultz, Deputy Secretary Peter Brady, and one of our unemployment insurance directors, Laurel Searles. I'll be brief in my remarks and leave most of the time to the committee to ask what I'm sure are a number of questions. At the onset, I want to specifically note we appreciate the partnership and professionalism of the legislative post-audit staff in working to complete this audit. We had a good working relationship with them. We look forward to continuing with them on the other parts of the audit that are still to come. That being said, the department has prepared an extensive response to the audit findings, which are included with the materials. Again, while we appreciate the partnership and professionalism, we raised several areas of concern with the audit as conducted and indicated in the report, specifically the methodology used to come up with their figures, their understanding of the unemployment insurance system and the differentiation between state programs and federal programs, as well as some of the conclusions they reach on impacts to Kansas employers and employees. Our response, again, is very detailed. This was a 1,000-year flood in many instances. The department from day one of the pandemic has been focused on the issue of fraud. To your question, Senator Thompson, I'm happy to clarify that in whatever manner you'd like. And we continue to do so as the pandemic and the recession related to it continue. So that being said, I'd be happy to answer any questions the committee may have.
Thank you, Deputy Secretary. I have 2 questions to get us started, and then I'll turn it over to our committee to further ask questions. Question number 1 is, it looks like Acting Secretary Amber Schultz stated yesterday that this opportunity was created by the widespread fraud that was due to Congress's actions, and that related unemployment programs and stop states from asking applicants basic verification questions. So my question would be, what specific basic verification questions did the federal government prohibit Kansas from asking?
That's an excellent question, Representative. And I know you like page numbers, so as I make these our response, I'll try and tie it to the page numbers as Matt did as well. So I think Matt did a good job of explaining some of the vulnerabilities that were created with the pandemic unemployment assistance program. Okay, there was an existing fraud prevention for PUA because PUA didn't exist prior to Congress putting that forward as part of the CARES Act. So PUA, one, there was no systems developed for it. You couldn't have security provisions in your PUA system because you didn't have a PUA system. Additionally, PUA reached an entirely new class of potential claimants who had never been before able to avail themselves of the unemployment insurance system: self-employed, gig workers, contract workers. So there was considerable debate at the time PUA was enacted between actually kind of an internal power struggle within USDOL between the Employment and Training Administration and the Office of Inspector General. The feedback and guidance given to the state was that we could not ask them for verifying documents of their employment, the type of standard things you would receive from someone to validate that are existent within the regular unemployment insurance program. So states were actually prohibited from getting that sort of documentation up front, and we simply had to take the claimant's word for it to a large degree and pay the benefits. And I think Matt did a good job of explaining why that was so tempting when you look at the dollar amounts and the lack of those pre-existing safeguards. It was a new program. Fortunately, Congress has recognized the fallacy in that approach, and that is no longer the case for the extension of PUA that has been done through the Continued Act. And if I can get my head around here, I'll try and get that page number for you within but that is covered in extensive detail in our response, Madam Chair, and members of the committee. The specific issues we had in terms of inability to act. We were prohibited from asking certain types of verifying questions for those types of claims.
All right, well, we'll, as a committee, take time to look at it to your response individually. My second question is in regarding to those different tools that you could, the Department of Labor could use to detect fraud. There was a series of list of items that were reported to us in December from the Department of Labor, and that would have been to the Special Committee for Economic Recovery. And one of those tools that were mentioned was the NASWA, and that this database or hub was launched in August, and that you could enroll into the program to help with some verifications and identity items. So when did Kansas become eligible and enroll in that?
I'll have to get back with you. I think we were fairly close to that in August. And to give a little context, Madam Chair, NASWA has within its purview something called the Integrity Center. So it's heavily funded by NASWA through the USDOL. and includes numerous integrally related measures that the states can take advantage of. It is staffed by, for the most part, former unemployment insurance officials who have retired or moved on. Kansas has been in cooperation and coordination with the NASWA Integrity Center from the start of the pandemic. We were having sometimes weekly meetings with our integrity liaison to determine best practices. So that IDH, or Integrity Data Hub, actually was existing prior to that August timeline. We've had some challenges over the past few years onboarding with that due to our mainframe-based system. We did start contributing data to them. Candidly, that's still something we're working on in terms of how we can better automate the data dumps we're providing them. We have those conversations with them on an almost weekly basis. But we did start using it pretty close to that time period. But that in of itself is not going to be an end-all be-all in terms of fraud prevention.
No, it's just one of the tools, but it just seemed like the Department of Labor relayed to our committee that you needed to be eligible and that you were still working on that. And I would note that on December 6th, we were told that you're still examining other options for fraud prevention. So in the midst of the highest rate of fraud, the Department of Labor said we are still examining other options, which was really way too late considering you received money on September 1st to stop fraud. And you had instructions and guidelines from the U.S. Department of Labor. So I think from our perspective, we don't understand why it took so long.
I think I would say that that's a mischaracterization of our testimony, Madam Chair. I think we are this very day examining fraud tools. That is a never-ending process. We have implemented a number of initiatives throughout, again, dating back to the start of the pandemic. And the IDH tool is one, the identity verification is one, and there are numerous others. So to say we took no action on fraud during that time period is an inaccurate statement.
I can only look at the graphs that were provided and the claims that were paid out. And there is a drastic difference of what's occurring now compared to what occurred prior. So whatever actions or tools or identity verifications were done were absolutely inadequate. So I'm not arguing with efforts, I'm arguing with outcomes. Other comments, other questions from committee? Senator Tyson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would follow up somewhat. You said that the federal government didn't restricted the verification, but the state did not. So why weren't there action taken to stop fraudulent from state claims?
Senator, I was speaking specifically to the PUA program in terms of what we are allowed to ask for on PUA, which contributed to the PUA fraud. That's an entirely distinct program for employment benefits. So the federal government gave guidelines on PUA. That impacted that. We did seek information that is standard required on regular unemployment claims like we normally would. There's a whole series of information someone has to have to file regular unemployment benefits. But what you have to understand in terms of the regular claims and why the situation was so difficult for states nationwide is we have never seen as states fraud attempts that were based so heavily on identity theft that was comprehensive in nature, where the fraudster had not only an SSN, legal name, and date of birth, they're able to circumvent some of the standardized cross matches that I think Representative Williams has referenced that are the backbone of fraud prevention in a standardized unemployment program. So we were
follow up.
cross matches.
I will just add, we
Madam
do.
Chair, if I could respond to the question I was asked. We were cross matches, but we didn't have the tools to deal with this new type of fraud that existed.
Okay, and thank you for clarification on that. And I would just ask that we provide really succinct answers, and it's because we are delayed, and that is our fault for being delayed.
Absolutely.
And so we do have 3 more questioners in the queue. So I would ask for very succinct answers and responses. Senator Tyson?
Thank you. I understand, Mr. Deputy Secretary, but my question is that $200 million were paid out. Wasn't it considered that we would use a cross-reference with an E-Verify system or other database to ensure that these were actually employees or people that were in the United States, working in the United States for these unemployment claims? Thank you.
Thank you. First of all, again, we disagree with the methodology used in the numbers of fraud that have been reported. So from our department's perspective, the numbers provided by LPA are not in line with what the data analysis that we have provided. Second of all, the advent of the key kind of tool in the toolbox on this that states have developed over the last few months has been that ID verification. E-verification would not have addressed these issues. We were doing the due diligence to try and determine if we had the feasibility of some sort of identification on the front end. We got some mixed signals from a technical perspective. Once we were able to resolve those, we then did a move aggressively to try and implement that. So the end result of that was the solution that is in place to now that I think we've all seen the positive results in terms of stopping those potential intrusions. But I think we've testified, and Representative Tarwater knows this, we have testified extensively that just adding these tools onto our existing system at the same time where our primary focus, to be mindful for those of you with constituent issues, still has to be to get benefits paid to all those people that are in need of assistance. So that is a delicate and laborious process to do all those things at the same time and keep our hodgepodge system up and running. So to say, I think there was a comment made that it was relatively simple to add that functionality. I can assure you it was not.
Senator Steffens, and then we'll have Representative Burrows and then Representative Tarwater.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Back looking at figure 1 on page 4, and you talked about how PUA created lots of problems for you, and that you're better prepared in the Kansas unemployment insurance pool. But you see, starting in September, the state claims skyrocket while the federal ones are coming back down and then start a very, very gentle incline. I'm a little confused on the statements that the federal program was problematic because it was kind of started up so rapidly. You know, when that begs the question, what did you not have in September and October? When I presume you're following these curves real time, at least I would, and you start to recognize that while our unemployment rate's not going up, these initial claims are just skyrocketing. What did you not have in September and October that you suddenly had in January other than the legislature came back in session?
Well, you make a good point, Senator. So, if you look at the kind of trend nationwide, PUA was kind of the first targeted. At some point in time, for reasons you'd have to confer with the fraudsters, there has been, and we've seen this with other states, a focus more on the regular benefits, which the states, including ourselves, thought was probably not as vulnerable. We were tracking those escalated claims figures. There's a couple different reasons for those. We've actually altered some of those figures because those were due to reporting errors with the conflation of some of these new benefit programs. But you're absolutely right. We were tracking those and we had concerns, but at that point in time, there wasn't sufficient indication that was widespread ID theft within the regular system. But we were still doing the due diligence in terms of what are the other programs we can bring online, increased use of the IDH, as Representative Williams has pointed out, and then at that time vetting and trying to establish the feasibility of these identity verification solutions that were out there. It was all kind of new to the UI space because identity verification was not something that was widely used. So we were kind of having to work from scratch to figure out how those could be implemented in conjunction with a regular benefit program. But you make a good point.
Representative Burrows.
Thank you, Madam Chair. If I may, Mr. Deputy Secretary, would you state these were sophisticated multi-fraud organizations that hacked our system or played into the amount of fraud that occurred on the PUA side?
Absolutely. Although one distinction, Representative, is I would avoid the use of the word hack in the sense that would imply a data breach, which I think we've testified consistently publicly. We have no basis to believe that has occurred of our system. But yes, there is no doubt that these were sophisticated criminal intrusions on not only our state, but states nationwide.
Thank you for the hack comment. That was deliberately played to ensure that you were able to announce that we hadn't had a breach of our system. Do we have an understanding of where we are on the national level, where Kansas comes in as far as the amount of fraud to our employer-based funds versus the PUA?
We do not, and that's an excellent question. I mean, most states have still not publicly gone forward with a fraud number and a methodology they use to create it. Some states have, and I believe we've got some information assembled for that. I don't have it right in front of me. I apologize. but many states are still trying to wrap their head around this in terms of the extent of the fraud that is out there.
If I may, Madam Chair, one more time. Anywhere in the audit, did it mention the lack of personnel or skilled personnel or the number of personnel necessary to address the sophisticated attempts at fraud within the unemployment? In other words, the onslaught of the claim filings. Did anywhere in the audit, did it talk about that?
No, it did not. And in fairness to the audit team, I don't know if that was within their original mandate. But you do need both, okay? We have increased our staff exponentially, and I think Matt made some salient comments about, to a certain extent, fraud detection is a little bit more manual than we would like. You have to have the staff to meet the workload that no matter what the tools are, as you've indicated, due to the massive number of claims. But you also do need the technologies that try and make that process more efficient, which is what we've been building through with the deployment of the multi-factor identity verification, as well as the Google fraud application that we are currently working into production.
Thank you. I would just like to state to those in the Department of Labor who have been working tirelessly to address the concerns of the legislators, thank you for your commitment, and under the most trying of times, I know we can always do better, but I sincerely appreciate their effort put forth by the Department of Labor with this onslaught of claim filing by the citizens of Kansas. And I just wish we could get the monies back to the individuals so that we can get this money back in the economy. This fraud issue is important to many in this room, but I personally want to say thank you for the due diligence that you're giving the legislators and the comments you presented today.
Representative Tarwater.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Deputy Secretary, how many 1099s were held back?
How many 1099s were held back? I apologize, I don't have that information in front of me. We will certainly circle back with that. In terms of the 1099 issue, if I can, Madam Chair, just give me, I know I'll give you 30 seconds here. We were pretty proactive on that front in terms of trying to engage with the IRS. I do want to clarify something from the audit report. Individuals who did not receive funds due to their identities being stolen will not be responsible under existing IRS guidelines. And again, I'm not a representative of the IRS. We're paying taxes on those amounts. We have an extensive effort to try and isolate those out from 1099s that were sent. We did have a portion that were sent, unfortunately, due to data errors to claimants. And we are in the process, as we speak, of issuing those revised 1099s where appropriate, they'll reflect $0 if someone was in fact the victim of identity theft. And then I think the audit report also indicates there is a process for victims of identity theft to resolve that issue if they did not get a corrected 1099 as we work to send those out. We can certainly get you the correct.
Thanks for all that information. How many, I'm assuming the 157,000 people that you decided were fraud, your 24% number, you did not send 1099s to them?
Absolutely not. I think it's an important distinction. That number represents claims filed, not claims paid. That goes, if you look at our response, that goes to probably a fairly substantive portion of what our contention is with the ultimate figures that were derived by the audit team.
So when can you get to us the number of 1099s that you did not send?
We can probably get that number to you today.
Oh, okay. Be great.
In the near future.
And then one last question. I'm sorry, Madam Chair. What's different about the program today? You referenced the simple fix that the company that you do business with said was a simple fix. You referenced that. It really wasn't a simple fix, but it was a 3-day fix. I'll give you that. You had to shut down the system for 3 days. What changed between when it became a priority? Your system, it's the same antiquated system. So what changed between, say, June and July, and even September when you got the funding, and then the very end of January when all our funds were gone? What changed in the antiquated system that made you be able to all of a sudden be able to fix it in 3 days?
To say that fix was put in 3 days is inaccurate, and I think you're referencing a media article from the president of LexisNexis.
Well, you shut the system down for 3 days is what I was referencing. I'm sorry.
We also shut the system down for 3 days to try and get a handle on in terms of our own claims processes. That process of vetting Doing the due diligence, building the business requirement, the coding to implement those solutions was substantially longer than 3 days. So nothing changed.
All right, we'll let the representative have one more question with a succinct answer.
You came up with 25% or 24%. In your experience with states, surrounding states, is that about the same? Or what are other states reporting that you said they pick a number? What are other states reporting as far as percent of fraudulent claims?
It is literally all over the map, and many states are not going publicly with numbers. I think if you wanted to amuse yourself, you could Google unemployment fraud and pick a state, and you will find any number of numbers, metrics, figures, and percentages that are currently at play in all of the different states.
You know what the average is, or would Matt, would you know what the average is?
Look to find a comparison of fraud in Kansas to other states, and I would say there's a lack of consistent data, even at the federal level, pulled together on fraud across the United States so far in 2020. It's something that's still being investigated.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
I think that points to any sort of assertion that we have had publicly made and numerous times that Kansas is somehow the only state or an outlier or number one in fraud is categorically false and not supported by any publicly available data.
Well, the only reason I asked, sir, was because every major company that we deal with that deals with other states tells us that Kansas is responsible for 97% of their fraudulent claims and only 10% or 20% respectively of their business. And so from what we can tell, Kansas was a much bigger problem than many other states. And so
with all due respect,
I'll just leave it at that. I'll just leave it at that, Madam Chair. Thank you.
That appears to be anecdotal information that, again, is not supported by the United States Department of Labor or NASWA. And candidly, it seems to be fitting a preconceived narrative that just is not supported by the publicly available figures from respective states.
Deputy Secretary, there are numbers in January that rank Kansas number 3 in the United States for the most claims filed. And so if you just take that to the proportion number of working Kansans we have, you know that there's a major problem. So the data will show itself. So I guess we don't have to argue about the anecdotal. It will reveal, the truth will be apparent. Senator Thompson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think the big question people want to know, and all my constituents want to know, is when are they going to start seeing their money? I know of one man who called 600 times to try to reach the department there and to get an answer, and he gets on one of these voice menu things, and it just recycles them out, and then they said the queue is full, and they can never get through. But I'm getting flooded with emails every day. And these people are desperate. They're losing cars, homes. This is dire for them. And I guess the question is, when is the money going to be flowing? And why aren't we staffing the helpline 24/7 until this clears up?
Thank you, Senator Thompson. And those are excellent questions. And I also want to note from the onset your partnership in terms of addressing your constituents. Since the onset of this, you've been great to work with our team. The money is flowing. I mean, we're making payments on a weekly basis. There are hurdles to resolve. And so for each individual claimant, I can't speak to what the issue is. A big part of it, Senator, is the continued implementation, which I think we've testified extensively to, and Chairman Tarwater's committee and other committees, is rolling out those Continued Assistance Act programs, right? The PEUC, which is now online, and those other programs coming in. That will resolve a lot of those. But I can't speak to individual claims. But the money is flowing, and continuing to have improved efficiencies, and those rollout will help.
I'm going to cut you off right there on that topic, just because that's kind of moving away from the topic of fraud. So I'm going to ask Senator Thompson to ask another question if it's fraud related.
No, I'm just wanting a status report so I can help my constituents know what's coming. They need some reassurance.
I completely agree with you, Senator, and I know that this will be continued discussion in your committees, but for right now, because of time, we're going to keep moving. Senator Ware.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. And kind of bouncing a little bit off of Senator Thompson's question, fraud is an incredibly important issue, and we really need whatever mechanism to dig down into it to find where the answers are and where the solutions are. I guess I'm new to this committee, and maybe I need a little historical perspective, but I'm wondering why we're focused on fraud with all our efforts to dig into the details, and not why don't we get more money to Kansans?
Well,
A
actually,
little more
Senator,
direct, maybe.
that's a very fair question, and we voted in June for the larger Department of Labor audit, and that would include how they're processing payments, what's right or wrong with the system, and that is the bigger picture. But because of the looming amount of money that was projected to be lost, Kansans will need to pay that back. We have 66,000 employers in Kansas. If we lose 300 million or 400 million from that unemployment fund, that has to be repaid. So that's important to Kansans too. So all of it is important. And so this committee voted to have this piece of the audit come up more quickly than the second piece, if that would answer your question.
It does, thank you.
All right, Senator Tyson?
Thank you, Madam Chair and Deputy Secretary. I would like to thank you and your department. I know that you guys have been working diligently. The problem is that it doesn't look like you're getting the support that you need from the top, or to get there are so many issues. You've seen this, you know this, and the legislature, we're just pushing because we do care for our constituents. We know you do. But my question is, you made a statement about we don't know that the system was hacked. I have many individuals that have fraudulent claims filed against them, and specific data that would have only come from the unemployment system. The business filed that information with unemployment and/or the Department of Revenue. Now, I don't know if you moved that data on up to the federal government, and that could have been a system that was exposed, but somehow those numbers were specific to information that is filed. Could you respond, please?
Yeah, thank you, Senator, and I appreciate your earlier thought in terms of our staff. And we are being supported, I would say that. So, and I appreciate you have a technical background as well. So, again, I don't want to sound like I'm just playing the same note here. There's a couple indications why we feel there has been no data breach, okay? One is every single state is seeing the same thing. So there's an unlikelihood that every single state has had their unemployment insurance systems compromised. Again, from public sector to private sector security and folks we've talked to, it's much more likely the result of widespread data breach. We have done internal reviews. We have had outside partners do reviews. And again, we have just not been able to substantiate that there has been a breach of our systems. But it's something we continue to monitor, Senator. I assure you, we do take the integrity of our systems seriously. And we actually have a legal obligation to report a data breach that if we were breached, we would have to trigger with it. So if you have those instances where you feel that you have something that's indicative, we would certainly like to connect with you offline, get with our information security officials and review that. But I can only go off what we have demonstrated. And this is something we have, again, state, our own internal staff, KSO, Kansas Information Security Office staff, outside partners have vetted this issue, and we have not been able to identify at any time a breach of our systems. But we do keep monitoring it because that could be the next evolution of some of the sophisticated fraud that's taking place. So that's the best I can respond to that question, ma'am.
All right, committee, are there any other questions for Deputy Secretary? Thank you, Mr. Deputy Secretary, for providing a response back. I would encourage our committee to take the time to read the 16 pages that were provided to us in the audit. If you have further questions, I would encourage you to reach out to the Deputy Secretary independently, and then continue to have these conversations, Senator Thompson and others, in your committees. And I know that the Commerce Committee in the House is working really, really hard on this particular topic. So Matt, thank you for providing the evaluation, the audit for us. Looks like Katrin or Justin, we probably don't have time for the security awareness training. Okay, so committee, just note that that was scheduled today, and we will postpone that. We do have a consent calendar item, and I need to recognize Chris to explain the consent item. There are a few 100-hour audits.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you, Madam Chair. There are a couple items on the consent calendar for today. First of all is the minutes from the January 20th meeting. The second item is the acceptance of the performance audit that you just heard. And then the third item, as Madam Chair mentioned, we have 2 limited scope audits that the chair has preliminarily approved. And just a reminder for committee members, any member who has an objection to a limited scope audit approved by the chair shall state such objection in the form of a motion to remove the limited scope audit from this list of consent calendar items. There are 2, like I said, they're attached to your consent calendar memo. One is comparing causes of death on death certificates before and after COVID. That is submitted by Representative John Barker. And the second is looking into grants received by local election officials, and that was submitted by Senator Tyson. Both of those are attached in Attachment B. I'll be happy to go over them briefly, or if anyone has any questions. Madam Chair?
All right, questions for Chris about those audits or anything else on the consent calendar? To know if you would request to abstain from voting on the minutes, you can do so. It's up to you. Any questions? All right, if there's no motion to object, then the consent calendar is adopted. All right, and at this time, thank you very much, Chris. At this time, I'll ask Justin to close this out with some information about next topics and next meeting.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll be very brief. So our next meeting is going to be in 2 weeks, Wednesday, March 10th, and we will be hearing the county procurement practices audit that was requested by Representative Topiker. So that is the sole performance audit. We will also be covering the security awareness training we have deferred today. With your permission, Madam Chair, we'll work with you to coordinate that item. And then a brief update on some of the data mining work that we do behind the scenes, looking at the state's procurement cards. We think that's a high-risk area, so we've done doing some work. Want to update you there. Also, if I may, Madam Chair, just a brief bill update. This committee introduced several bills. Just to give you a quick status, those are making their way through the process. Probably the most updated version is substitute for House Bill 2049, which makes it clear that we do not pay state agencies for data when it's requested for an audit. Has just been put on the Senate consent calendar today. It moved out of Senate Ethics and Transparency Committee. So that one has been it's made its way through the House. It's now sitting on the Senate consent calendar. Likewise, Senate Bill 16, which is the one that removes those old financial reporting requirements. You remember state agencies have to report information we don't really need. That has made it through the Senate and is in House appropriation and has had a hearing held. So that's probably the furthest version of that bill. So just wanted the members to know that that legislation is progressing. Happy to answer any other questions the committee may have, Madam Chair.
Any other questions for Justin? Thank you for your patience today. Thank you for everyone that is here, and we are now adjourned.